Hitchcock, or as we're now calling it, The Girl, the prequel. So a film about the making...
Who's calling it that?
I am.
Okay.
The film about the making of Hitchcock's Psycho, with Sir Anthony Hopkins doing his best as Hitchcock, donning the fat suit, doing the drawl. And the story is that he's gambling his entire career, basically, on what he himself described as a nasty little story, which the studio do not wish to back, in which he has absolute total faith, and which, as I think everyone knows, and this isn't a plot spoiler, at a very early stage in the movie, does something which no movie is allowed to do, kills off its leading lady. Here's a clip.
Just think of the shock value. Killing off your leading lady halfway through. I mean, you are intrigued, are you not, my dear? Come on, admit it. Admit it.
Actually, I think it's a huge mistake. You shouldn't wait till halfway through. Kill her off after 30 minutes.
Wow.
Sir Anthony and Dame Helen
Eating toast.
eating toast. Yes, but I didn't set that up. That in fact, of course, there was a toast theme going on.
Breakfast conversation.
So the first thing to say is it is impossible not to look at this in the light of The Girl. I mean, there just isn't. The two things are. I mean, actually, funnily enough, they do bookend each other, because at the end of this, we see Hitchcock effectively getting the inspiration to go on and make the Birds, and we had Toby Jones on the show before Christmas, and I said this then, I'll say it again now. I do think that Toby Jones's performance as Hitchcock, and Imelda Staunton actually is Thelma, is closer and more accurate in terms of the real person. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, but what it means is that what Toby Jones was doing was more embodying what the actual Hitchcock was like, and what we get with Hopkins is something rather different. Hopkins did an absolutely brilliant job of doing Richard Nixon, and the real genius of what he did with Nixon in that Oliver Stone biopic is that he got the mannerism and the sense right, despite the fact that actually he didn't look very much like Nixon at all, but he did get the mannerism. He somehow reconfigured the way his shoulders hung, even the way the jowls appeared to hang off his cheeks, and it wasn't a performance that was led by makeup, it was a performance that was led by physical action. I feel that less so in the case of this. I think what you get here is much more, I don't mean this to sound as harsh as it does, but is much more pantomime-y. The other thing is that in the case of The Girl was a film which went out on television, which had a very clear line of argument. And the line of argument may have been controversial and may also have been massively overstated, but it was a line of argument. And essentially the line of argument was that Hitchcock was horrible to his leading lady. Obviously the film was inspired by the accounts of the leading lady in question. And I know an awful lot of people, film academics, who revere Hitchcock, as does everybody, understandably, saying, well, I refuse to watch that because that film is basically a hatchet job of a guy who was a genius by an actress who was never anything more than his second-rate muse, and how dare they? The thing is that whether or not you think that it's an accurate portrait in terms of The Girl, it has a very, very clear through line. The through line is it's just going to pursue this slightly mad version of events. In the case of Hitchcock, the film about the making of Psycho, you get something very different, which is you get a much more sort of likable, balanced in inverted commas, softer round the edges take on essentially the same thing, which is that an awful lot of Hitchcock's art was based on voyeurism, was based on a form of sort of repressed sexuality, or actually unrepressed sexuality, and you can see within his dramas, repeated over and over again, tropes which obsessed and interested him, which are fundamentally tied up with the cinematic experience. I mean, Scorsese talks about, every filmmaker talks about this, and that's fine. There's no great insight in that. Everyone knows that these things are writ large through Hitchcock's work, like the words, brighten in the middle of a stick of rock. That's how it works. The question then, therefore, is what does the film do with that? I mean, we all know what happens with Psycho. We know that it becomes a huge, massive hit, and in terms of it being a publicity campaign, it's very interesting because Hitchcock did all this theatricals about you're not allowed to come in after the beginning of the film. The trailer, which showed nothing of the film but had Hitchcock walking around the set. I mean, it has passed into common law. So what is there that we don't know? And the answer is very little. And what you end up getting is a drama that has got an awful lot of chubby stuff in it. There's an awful lot of people walking on, dressed as somebody famous, very briefly performing a role as somebody famous, and then almost effectively taking their bow and leaving. So, we get a brief appearance of the Joe Stefano character, who basically turns up long enough to hand over a script, which we're then told isn't good enough and has to be rewritten by Alma. We get a very convincing version of Anthony Perkins, all sort of small and bird-like and slightly out of whack. We get Scarlett Johansson, who's terrific as the leading lady, the blonde bombshell at the centre of all this. You get all of those things, and you go, okay, the attention to detail is nice, and the costume is nice, but what you don't get is any further than that. Also, there is something odd, which is that if as an awful lot of film fans do, an awful lot of film fans know an awful lot about the making of Psycho. And although Saul Bass is in there, there's a character who's Chris Wallace Lang is actually credited as playing Saul Bass. It seems peculiar that when you're doing things like the shower sequence, there's a moment when Hitchcock grabs the knife to show how to stab. You think, well, actually, it's weird because there's a whole section of this story that kind of isn't being told, which is Saul Bass was the storyboarder, and there's this ongoing debate which has raged for years about what exactly Bass did on set during the period that it took to shoot the shower scene. So the film ends up falling between two swords. On the one hand, the girl simply alienated a bunch of people who love and revere Hitchcock because they thought it was a character assassination. And when Toby came on, he said he was trying to make it not that, and he tried to find his way around the character and make the character sympathetic. But it is true that the drama of the girl is very much a kind of very negative portrayal of Hitchcock. What you have here is something which isn't going to do that and isn't going to alienate the Hitchcock fans, but also seems to be saying to all the people who know anything about the making of Psycho, we're just going to nod generally towards all the things you kind of know about it already, and then not go beyond that. And what's strange about it is, in the places that it tries to go beyond that, is in, for example, a recurrent motif in which Hitchcock is essentially visited by the ghost of Ed Gein, because the Robert Bloch story of Psycho is inspired by the story of Ed Gein, the Wisconsin ghoul, who then actually inspires a number of cinema figures, later on, Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, James Gumb from, Silence of the Lambs. I mean, the legacy of Ed Gein is huge. But when Robert Bloch saw the story about, an ordinary guy, in inverted commas, turns up in Plainfield, Wisconsin, turns out to be that he's a necrophile. And Bloch, I interviewed Bloch and I interviewed Joe Stefano, and he said what's really fascinating about that idea is the idea simply that the killer could be the boy next door. But that's the extent of the Gein influence. I mean, the character of Norman Bates is not Ed Gein. And so there's this weird thing when Hitchcock goes into these reveries when he's kind of visited by the ghost of Ed Gein, who sort of talks him through the process of Psycho, which doesn't quite work. Then there's a sort of a semi-romantic thing which is happening with Alma in order to beef up her character and make it apparent just how important she is in this story, which she is. And yet somehow that never really follows through. And you end up with this thing. I mean, it's not that it's not fun. It is divertingly fun, but, and I say this in the knowledge that it's the BAFTAs on Sunday, and so another opportunity for me to get handbagged by Helen Mirren for saying the same thing again. It's not really a film. I mean, it's ironic that The Girl was made for television, and you said yourself, would stand up in the cinema. In the case of this, it's made as a film, but it looks for all the world like a TV drama that's literally ticking the boxes, going him, her, that, tab A, slot B. And it's got a very, very sort of shallow insight both into Hitchcock's psyche and the making of the film. And you come out of it afterwards thinking, well, it was fun, but kind of flimsy. And the weird thing is, to make a film about Hitchcock that's kind of flimsy and kind of fun, but doesn't have any sort of meat, there's much more meat on The Girl, which at least is nasty. I mean, spiteful, but at least it's got oomph.